This is BBC Two. Now it's time for us to join Rob Curling for an in-depth look at South Africa.
This week, white South Africans went to the polls in 2 parliamentary by-elections. To convince voters that they weren't going soft on what they see as subversive organisations, the government imposed further restrictions on opposition groups. 17 anti-apartheid organisations were banned from any political activity. And in an unprecedented move, the Archbishop of Cape Town, Desmond Tutu, was arrested. Good afternoon. Although Archbishop Tutu was quickly released, tension has remained high. This week in Issues, we'll be looking at some of the events that have led up to that tense situation in South Africa today. Conflict, in fact, has been almost a part of everyday life in South Africa for a very long time. It's a country where blacks outnumber whites by nearly 5-1, but where the whites hold virtually all the power. It's a country you can single out from all others by one stark fact: your way of life is controlled completely by the colour of your skin. True enough, racism affects many countries throughout the world, Britain included, yet it's only in South Africa that race is actually written into the law of the land. Everybody in South Africa is classified by race into 4 main groups. In the black category, there are 23 million people. That's nearly 3/4 of the population. In the Asiatic category, people of mainly Indian origin, 1 million. Coloured, people of mixed race, 3 million, and white, people of European origin, 5 million. That this minority of whites have nearly all the political power, whilst the blacks haven't even got the right to vote, is, not surprisingly, the root of the South African crisis. The history of white power in South Africa goes back a long way. In this film extract we're going to show, made 30 years ago, you can get some idea of the system set up by the whites. Just as important, though, the film shows the attitudes and opinions of that time, not only on what is heard from the white South Africans, but also in what the film itself says. In the eyes of a black South African, much of what we hear is wrong, some of it extremely offensive.
They don't seem worried about the future in South Africa, but how it goes depends on what they think. Maybe they'll be content to accept the government's idea that they're inferior to the white man, and they'll be happy to grow up as second-class citizens in their own country. Or perhaps things will go the other way. In a few years' time, there could be a great African revolt, and those children might be taking part in it. I wonder.
Whatever you do to them, Africans are always cheerful. The music surges up in them. Their love of life bursts through. This is Alexandra Township, Johannesburg. Even in dingy surroundings like these, I felt the pulsating vitality of the Africans, and their overwhelming numbers made a tremendous impact on me. The Europeans made South Africa. They feel they ought to have the best place in it. They built towns like Johannesburg. Parts of Johannesburg are so modern that they're almost like an American skyscraper town. 80 years ago, before the gold, there was nothing here at all. Now there is a rich town, sunlit, wide and spacious. But always at the back of their minds, Europeans have a fear that non-Europeans will somehow crowd them out of it. This was explained by the editor of the leading Afrikaner newspaper.
If we give freedom to our colonial peoples inside our own country, and they are a majority, we would immediately be swamped. And that is our basic dilemma.
There's always been segregation. Africans have to stand and wait for their buses in the sun. An empty seat may be a few yards away. They cannot sit on it. It's reserved for Europeans at their bus stop. Signs of separation are everywhere on public and private buildings. Africans must go to their own cinemas and not to Europeans. At this place, Africans must queue to get their passes. They must carry them everywhere. If the police stop an African and he has forgotten his book of passes, they put him into jail. Every African needs passes to work or live near a white town. He must have another one if he wants to travel. There are many different types of permits required, and some have to be renewed monthly. Once out of a reserve, the African lives in a sea of papers. Those papers make sure that the African stays in his place.
That film contains one of the key reasons why white South Africans feel so strongly that despite their relatively small numbers, they have the right to rule South Africa, namely that the whites made South Africa, and before they came there was nothing there. In one way, that's wrong because there were people living there when the whites arrived. Broadly speaking, South African whites fall into two groups. First, the Afrikaners. They make up 2/3 of the white population. Their history goes back nearly 300 years to the time they set up pioneer farming communities, driving out the blacks as they did so. The Afrikaners, who came mainly from Holland, saw South Africa very much as their new home country, and for them, South Africa has been home ever since. The second group of whites are English-speaking, mainly from Britain. They developed South African industry, starting with the gold mining business mentioned in the film. Today, that industry has mushroomed into billions of pounds worth of investment from all over the world. Yet to link the development of South Africa entirely to the efforts of the whites is to leave out the majority, the black population. It always was, and still is, the black workforce that helped South Africa become one of the world's big industrial nations. Were it not for the blacks working in industry, on the land, in public services and as domestic help, the country would collapse. To this day, in fact, there's a system in South Africa that makes sure that the vast majority of blacks stay exactly where they are, a labour force that mans the economy. That system was originally called Apartheid. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word meaning literally apartness or separation, and its introduction by the white government dates from 1948. Apartheid was seen as a way of separating the races by law, and hardly any part of everyday life was untouched by it. It covered where you lived, where you went to school and what sort of education you got, where you could go for entertainment, whom you could marry, where you worked and what kind of jobs were open to you. The biggest step, though, was to divide the country into black and white areas. 13% of the country was to become the so-called black homelands. All blacks would eventually be assigned to one of them, and that meant moving huge numbers of them there from white South Africa, the remaining 87% of the country. In this area, blacks would in fact be foreigners, with only the right to live there and work there temporarily. The mastermind of apartheid was Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd. To South Africa's blacks, who saw nothing but a desperate future under apartheid, the way Verwoerd described the system must have seemed unbelievable.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness, accepting that there are differences between people. But while these differences exist, and you have to acknowledge them, at the same time, you can live together, aid one another, but that it can best be done when you act as good neighbors always do.
Black opposition to apartheid came overwhelmingly from the African National Congress, the ANC.
These are the various heads under which the Native Laws Amendment Bill is arranged.
For many years, the ANC believed in peaceful protest.
These, I hope you understand, are the heads, and these
What changed all that was an event that happened in 1960.
Understood by you all.
The place was Sharpeville, an African township. There was a demonstration against the law stating that all blacks carry passbooks. The police opened fire on the crowd. 69 blacks were shot dead. 150 were injured. After Sharpeville, blacks began to doubt whether peaceful protest was enough. The ANC leader, Nelson Mandela.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Mandela went underground to lead a guerrilla army, and the ANC was banned. He was captured and sentenced to life imprisonment. He's still in prison after 25 years, but to this day, the vast majority of blacks still consider him their leader. In 1976 came another confrontation which, like Sharpeville, black South Africa has never forgotten. A protest by students, black and white, against the school system in black areas turned into a riot when the police moved in to break it up. Young blacks had run out of patience. After years of living under apartheid, their anger reached boiling point. In Soweto township in 1976, the clashes with the police saw 208 young blacks die. The Soweto massacre was like the last straw. With no vote and no right of protest, blacks were pushed more and more towards direct action as the only way to change the country. The ANC leader's wife, Winnie Mandela, was and still is her husband's voice in South Africa and abroad. After Soweto, was she prepared to take up a gun to achieve what she regarded as black freedom?
Now I know I can. In the past I didn't. But when I saw my children mowed down in Soweto in 1976, then I realized that in order to defend that, I would do exactly the same. If in order to attain my ideals, I have to shoot back at that man.
Following the Soweto killings, thousands of young blacks fled the country and joined the ANC guerrilla army in neighbouring black countries. From there, they were to plan acts of sabotage against targets inside South Africa. The ANC's actions convinced most whites that the guerrillas were a real threat. The pressure was on the South African government to recognise that fact. The man who had to face that problem was P.W. Botha, leader of South Africa since 1978. Botha knew that there were whites who wanted a better deal for the blacks, whites who didn't, and 23 million blacks struggling for what they saw as liberation. In a difficult message, Botha promised a crackdown on violence, but at the same time told whites they must adapt or die. Under Botha, some of the everyday apartheid laws were lifted. Signs like these would be removed from the streets. The government put money into improving some of the black townships. Yet as far as blacks were concerned, it was all a question of too little, too late. As they continued to look out onto the riches of a country owned and run by the whites, they were unconvinced of the so-called progress. The fact is, however, that for the black South Africans, little of real importance has changed since President Botha came to power. The unjust system which denies blacks the opportunities and standard of living available to whites is still in place, and most black South Africans live in townships that don't look very different from the one shown in the BBC film we saw earlier, made in 1957. This is Munseyville, a black township near Johannesburg in 1986. Apartheid forces blacks to live in small areas where often the most basic facilities are missing. 500,000 new homes are needed to replace black housing such as this. People's frustrations had been pushed to breaking point. In 1986, Munsterville proved fertile ground for those determined to change South Africa.
I am Africa. I'm the blessed desert yonder. Azania. Here I come from Apartheid, in the land of sorrow, from the marathon bondage, the Soweto massacre, flames of Soweto, sparks of Munsterville.
The young people in the township formed the Munsterville Youth Congress, part of an organised network of activists called the Comrades, who gained control of the townships throughout South Africa. This new generation had learned something most of their parents never knew.
What is the difference between the way your parents feel about white men and the way you feel about white men?
The difference is my parents have accepted the situation, and my parents are taking a white man as a person who is a superior and a person who is never making a mistake. And right now, what I'm realizing is I and a white man, we are on the same level. We can be wrong and we can be right. That is the difference between me and my parents.
In the Comrades' takeover of Munsterville, the incidents involved black violence against fellow blacks. Here, they burned down the home of one of the black councillors. The councillors were part of a government system that gave blacks a limited share in the control of their own affairs. In reality, most of the power was retained by white officials. The rule of Munsterville's Comrades stretched to the adjoining white town. They ruled that blacks must not buy from shops owned by whites, and they mounted patrols to enforce their laws. The South African government called the Comrades communists. But in Munsterville, religion is at the heart of community life, and many young people have turned to priests preaching the evils of apartheid.
I think it's important that the young people realize that it is not God's will that any people should live under such a system. I think that things cannot return to what they were, that the young people are absolutely determined that they're not going to live under the same oppression as their parents did.
That was part of one of the last documentaries to be made in South Africa by the BBC. Since then, a state of emergency has been declared, and the press, including the foreign press, have been tightly controlled in what they can report. On top of that, thousands of people have been detained without trial, curfews have been imposed, and people's freedom of movement severely restricted. Until recently, scenes like this were often shown on our TV screens, but the South African government began to realize that shots of riots and killings were damaging the image of the country, and they began to clamp down on the press.
You people, let's get out now very quickly, okay? Okay. Because you people are the cause of this now. Yeah, all right. So get out. Okay.
Depart from this place.
Please wait a bit.
Within 3 minutes, you commit offense. It's now 2:36.
The crowd dispersed. We were arrested. There appeared no legal reason. We were eventually released. An appropriate way to end a year reporting South Africa.
A state of emergency was introduced, a legal device which enables the government to impose a whole variety of restrictions on the press and on protesters, and to give the police wide-ranging powers. The filming of this beating so offended the government that they expelled the BBC's Michael Burke for even reporting it. In the government's latest move, anti-apartheid groups such as the multiracial United Democratic Front and the Confederation of South African Trade Unions are prevented from engaging in any political activity. It seemed that the only voice of protest left was the church.
Together, the largest gathering of church leaders ever to take on the government.
But, as this week's events have shown, the churchmen are not even allowed to deliver a petition to Parliament.
This was the culmination of years of increasing protest by the church, their most direct challenge yet. Still within sight of the cathedral, the churchmen were brought to a stop to be told that their action was illegal and action would be taken. Almost immediately, the arrests started. In the confusion as police moved in on journalists as well as clergy, Archbishop Tutu was arrested. At this point, the police were after those clergy they regarded as the ringleaders, and further action was taken, which I am not allowed to report.
Well, that was the BBC's James Robbins reporting under the restrictions placed on him by the South African government. They claim that those restrictions on reports, particularly of violence, have cut down on the amount of violence taking place. Of course, with those restrictions in force, we don't know whether or not that is the case. A point I put earlier to Michael Burke, BBC Southern Africa correspondent, until his expulsion last year.
It's almost certain that the violence in South Africa goes in cycles. You can appreciate the situation in a black township. The turmoil involved in some of the violence in 85 and 86 was enormous. Kids didn't go to school, it was impossible to go shopping. People get tired of it after a while. However angry they might feel politically, they get tired of living in that manner. And the violence goes in slightly decreasing cycles. And I think it's almost certain that that violence has declined, and declined quite sharply. The annoying thing, to a certain extent from the South African government's point of view, is that in restricting reporting of events in South Africa, people don't know really whether the violence has really declined as the government claims, or whether it's just because they've stopped people reporting on it.
How do you interpret the arrest of Bishop Desmond Tutu on Monday this week?
Oh, there's lots of interesting implications from that. The first and most obvious one is that by arresting the head of the Anglican Church in South Africa and a Nobel Peace Prize winner to boot, it once more, I think, shows that the South Africans couldn't care less about world opinion or the opinion of anybody outside the country, and the majority of the people inside the country either. I think the only opinion the South African government is particularly anxious about are its own white voters, and particularly those Afrikaner, Dutch-descended Afrikaner whites, who are liable to be voting in by-elections which are coming up, crucial by-elections which are coming up in the Transvaal, in very conservative parts of the Transvaal, and they feel rather threatened by the fact that there are a large number of right-wing Afrikaners who think President Botha and his government are going soft on black people and preparing to give the country away to them.
So, Michael, you're saying that the solution might be a more violent one, then?
Well, I don't know whether that would be a solution. I just think that, not immediately, because the only organisation left that can express an anti-apartheid opposition outside the Parliament are now the churches. And they're not in the business of organising violent insurrection. But a lot of black leaders, a lot of radical leaders, and most of their organisations have now been suppressed. And the army and police in South Africa are strong enough to keep a pretty hard grip on what's going on. But the fact is that I think by acting in this manner, the South African government is perhaps storing up a lot of ill will that will one day burst out, as it did in 1976, as it did in 1984. And when that happens, it's difficult to predict exactly what sort of situation we're going to be left with.
Michael Berg, thank you. In among all the question marks hanging over South Africa's future, one thing seems certain. According to the South African government itself, by the year 2020, there'll be 6.5 million whites in South Africa and 65 million blacks. In little over one generation from now, blacks will outnumber whites by 10 to 1.
We have a just cause on our side. It is our country.
We are settled here. It's our land. We fought for it. We've worked for it. This is ours.